about wood pruning and how to optimize our decision making when we're doing making our pruning decisions. So it's been an interesting morning. I'm in a region where power outages are occurring, so we've been chasing down electricity for the first half of our morning, but we're here with you. We're making it work. So myself, I'd like to introduce. I've been with Fruition Sciences for 3 years now. I just moved down here to California, but I started working with them in Walla Walla, Washington, and where I've got to use this technology that we're going to talk about today. So it's a really interesting concept of using lasers to take very precise measurements of your shoots. And with that, we're going to introduce Thibaut, who is our one of the founders of Fruition Sciences. He's got his master's in winemaking and a PhD in viticulture, and he's been working with and helping us understand this technology for several years now. So Thibaut, welcome.
Thank you, Ryan. Today I'm here to share with you some insights on how we can implement a new method to optimize pruning.
Yeah. I just want to double check with the audience right quick. Thibaut, we've had a message that somebody doesn't have any audio, so I want to make sure if anybody else can let us know if they can't hear us, because it's usually in the corner there's a mute button possibly that could be stopping you from hearing. So, okay, great. So let me just check back in with Jim. You may double check that you're unmuted for the sound. So, okay. So yeah, we'll dive into this method. So in wine and fruit, quality is not to your satisfaction. You know, one of the first steps that we can look at is to prepare for the new vintages is trying to correct some of the prunings. So the question you got to ask yourself is, how do we know if we need to increase or decrease the number of the shoots? And we're going to go through some methodology right now that'll really help us dive into those using these questions in this methodology. So why it's important to collect shoot data, why the wood production is one of the key indicators of your pruning decisions, and how to align your pruning strategy with your yield and quality goals.
All right.
Yeah.
Sorry. No, thank you, Ryan. Essentially, historically, wine growers have always in mind this feeling that there must be a good balance between the amount of energy that's devoted to produce wood and the amount of energy that's devoted to produce good fruit conditions during the ripening phase. So Ravaz had been one of the first scientists to try to quantify this balance by looking at the ratio between the amount of fruit and the amount of pruning wood that's collected after the season has gone, assuming that fruit is giving you a sense of how much energy goes into the reproductive sinks, since fruit can be seen as a sink where all the energy needed to make fruit compounds, sugars or flavonoids go. And the pruning wood weight is actually a proxy for the amount of energy that goes towards making vegetative parts, whether we look at leaves or carbohydrates being stored into the shoots, the trunk, or the roots. The issue we have with this historical method is that it requires, after harvest, to go in the field, identify a few vines, cut the shoots, weigh the shoots, and therefore it's time consuming, it's quite expensive. And after you're done with your pruning weight, you need to compile manually what you've been collected, and you only have a point measurement. And then you have to either have some sense of vine production in terms of weight of fruit, or most often people look at the weight of the block divided by the number of the vines and get a sense in terms of yield per vine. This technique is also only representative if the block is perfectly uniform. But in fact, the pruning of the vine comes only from a few, the pruning weight comes only from a few vines. And so that's a difficulty when we try to deal with pruning criteria in a block that's not uniform. And also, once you have these numerical value for the ratio between fruit weight and pruning weight, it's sometimes difficult to interpret. For instance, when the ratio is low, is it because you have too many shoots, or is it because each individual shoot is too large? And knowing that distinction between having too many shoots versus shoots that are too large has two very different consequences in terms of not only pruning management, but also vineyard stress management and canopy management. And we'll discuss that in a minute. So this is why the key question really is what we have in the next slides is, do we need to increase or to decrease the number of shoots if we wish to achieve a good balance between the energy that goes towards making vegetative parts and the energy that goes towards making fruit? So how do we go about that? How can we leverage new technologies and advances in scientific understanding of plant response to practices and season? Well, this is what the new method is about. The new method will provide you with automatically acquired maps that are easy to read and that directly give you insights into how much wood has been produced. The good things about those maps is that they do not require an extra path in the vineyard, since they can be generated while performing pre-pruning. And it gives a more objective insights in how together practices and seasonal conditions will affect your vineyard balance. So how is that different from the old pruning approach? It's a little bit what I have tried to summarize in this next slide. Essentially, in the past, we used to have, for those who are familiar with the yield over pruning weight ratio, an estimate of the balance between the energy flowing into vegetative parts, such as leaves, shoots, roots, trunks, and the reproductive parts, that is to say the fruit, by looking at this ratio, assuming that the weight of the pruning shoots, of the pruned shoots, is a proxy for the amount of energy that's directed towards sources organ, that is to say the leaves or everything that stores starch, like the roots, the trunks, the shoots. And in the new method, instead of having the pruning mass, we have this index that we call the wood index. And the wood index, simply put, is the sum of all the shoot sections that belongs to the vine. And I explain in a minute how we get that number. Then the last and very important point is that with this new method, we can distinguish what is the contribution of a high or a low shoot number at increasing or decreasing the amount of wood pruning weight versus the shoot diameter. And this is important because usually when we prune, we assume that when shoot number goes down, individual shoot diameter goes up and vice versa. However, this is not always the case. And sometimes we might be fooling ourselves thinking that we are going to reduce shoot diameter by increasing shoot number, but we see that the intrinsic properties of the block can totally cope with more shoots, with a larger vineyard, and with a larger number of shoots per vine, and these further unbalance the vineyard. So I am going to explain in a minute why shoot diameter and shoot number analyzed simultaneously is mission critical. And the last thing we will have with this method that we did not have before is that we will have a map of the wood distribution, which we could not have before with only point measurements. So this brings me to essentially how after you collect shoot data, the information will look like. Ryan, I see you wanted to say something.
Yeah, so just to double check and also possibly clarify. So one thing that we need to keep in mind as we're going through this presentation is that you know the normal thinking, or what I've kind of gathered from learning with you, is that, you know, I assumed shoot number as it went down, the shoot diameter would go up, but that's not always the case, and that's what we're going to see here when we measure using these precise tools. And just talking about the tool right quick before we go into it. So our tool versus the old method, this is a laser that goes on a four-wheeler frame, and you drive up and down the rows. So just to kind of to give a visual or put it in the people's minds, kind of how we're collecting this data that we'll be going through and why it's so important. So Thibaut.
Yeah, so in fact, before I briefly go into the nitty-gritty on how this data is obtained, I just wanted to show you visually how the new method to diagnose how wood distribution is a feature of each block. This is what we're going to be using. We're going to be using maps showing shoot number. Here you see on your left on our 360 VT website how essentially you can get a very important insight that you couldn't see with your eyes, really. And this is actually mapping the spatial distribution of how shoot number per vine varies. And since each data has a GPS label, we can precisely identify the shape and size of areas where we have a high versus a low shoot number. And on your right-hand side, you see actually what we call the wood index, which is expressed in terms of square millimeter of shoot section divided by square meter of ground area. So it really gives you an idea of what is the intrinsic ability of the ground where the vine is planted at producing wood. So eventually, we think those tools are good to keep advancing modern viticulture because it gives you automatically a map which is going to help you supporting your decision, which is what wine growers and winemakers are best at making. It's meaning strategizing the management for the whole year in order to balance better the vineyard. So you no longer have manual data to compile. You can only focus your time and decision making based on those maps. And in case the first year you do not understand, our team is here to help you. So now, go ahead, Ryan.
I'm just going to try to make some assumptions off this map real quick. So we see that the shoot number here, it's in the green, so we see that it's a high shoot count. And then when we look on the right on the wood index, we see that it's red, so it's a low wood index. So I was just curious, I mean, can we assume that there's a lot of shoots, but they're small diameter?
Yeah, actually, there is a third map that is missing here, which is a map of shoot diameter, and that will directly answer your question. We simply didn't want to overload the screen with too many maps, but yes, you are asking the right question. When you have a low wood index, like you see in the D block on the upper part of your maps, you may ask yourself the question, is my wood index low because I don't have enough shoots? Or is it low because each individual shoot is too thin? Or is it a combination of both?
Yeah. So, and which brings us to our next one, you know, why is this, why looking at that wood index, why is it such a key indicator when we're making these decisions?
Yeah, I really believe that wood production is a key indicator because it's a very strategic information for your whole yield management dilemma. And again, I want to make sure we understand what wood index reflects. Wood index is a proxy for the amount of energy that is stored as a reserve, as carbohydrates. Why carbohydrates are very important? Because at the beginning of the season, from bud break up until 6 to 8 leaves, the vine is not self-sufficient. It does not have enough photosynthetic energy to work. Therefore, it relies upon burning fuel, carbohydrates, that's already there, that has already been stored from last season. So the wood reserves is really important to fuel a good bud break before the vine becomes self-sufficient from an energy standpoint. And then the second strategic asset that reserves are giving to vineyard performances is that when we have more wood reserves, the vine is more resilient to extreme climatic events. It's more drought resilient. It also is better equipped to maintain a steady yield, etc., etc. So this is why we typically observe a decline in the amount of wood being produced per unit of ground area before the yield declines. So this is why when you complain or worried that your block yield is not performing as high as it used to in the past, it's very likely that you had some early signs before showing your vineyard less and less able to refill its own carbohydrate reserves. So this is why strategically thinking, anticipating a decline in terms of wood accumulation is key because it prefigures very likely decline in terms of yield, which is going to threaten your sustainability in terms of vineyard production.
Yeah, and so I just want to recap right quick with the definition of wood index, and you mentioned that the wood index was a proxy of something. So if you could just remind me what the definition and equation of was that for the wood index. And
yeah, so the wood index, imagine you see a vine, and this vine has 10 shoots, and each shoot is 10 millimeter in terms of shoot diameter. Okay, so by looking at 10 shoot times the section of 10 millimeter shoot diameter, you can get a number. And this number reflects how well the vine has been able to store carbohydrates. Because remember, the wood has essentially two functions. It's either for a structural purpose, what makes the plant standing upright, or for non-structural purposes, which means reserves. The wood is also made of starch, and when starch is broken down, it liberates sugars, and the sugar is the fueling energy for the plants to produce more vegetative parts, and later during the season to produce fruit. So the wood is a proxy for how much energy I have in order to have a good bud break and as a vine being able to ripen properly my fruit. Does that clarify, Ryan?
Yes, it does. I appreciate that. And just we have a question to clarify a little bit about, I guess I'll read it out and see if I understand correctly. It says wood index numerator is square millimeters of shoot, which is area, but shoots are three-dimensional. Where is it measured? Which axis? So it sounds like the person is asking how we're getting this measurement of shoot diameter.
Okay, look at my finger and imagine this finger is a shoot. I will have a laser beam that's going to come and measure the section of the shoot and count that as one shoot. So thanks to my laser beam going in front of that shoot, I will know exactly the position of the shoot and the shoot diameter.
Mm-hmm.
If I have the shoot diameter, if I assume the shoot is perfectly cylindrical, which, okay, is not true, I can get then a shoot section. And then if I have 10 shoot, I have 10 shoot sections.
Yeah.
The sum of all those shoot sections per vine gives me an idea of the intrinsic ability of this vine at producing wood. Exactly like you try to do when you measure pruning weight of the shoots you just have pruned. Except instead of measuring a mass, we are measuring a section.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I've operated the four-wheeler before and understand like it's taking hundreds of measurements at every second, right? And so when that laser beam is interrupted, it's based on speed. So depending on how fast you're going, it's taking that calculation into effect to tell you how wide that shoot is.
Yeah, I wasn't planning today to dive into the technicality of the Physiocap. For those of you who wants to dive into the technical and nitty-gritty, we're happy to do that after the webinar. Today, I wanted really to focus on how we can make this data actionable to support decision.
Great.
So,
well, thank you, Madeline, for that question. And yeah, Thibaut.
Sorry?
I was just thanking Madeline.
Yeah, so one of the key strategic information to have before the yield starts declining is to detect whether my wood production is declining. And that's a very strategic info you can get. And then the second thing you can have, one of the fear of any wine grower is to have a perfect block following a few years of high vegetative expression to start performing less well, simply because we have a trend towards excess wood production. When that happens, it's like maneuvering a very large boat. It will take a few years to get that balance back into track. So being able to detect early that there is an excessive production of wood gives you very strategic information, not only as far as how to improve your pruning techniques, but also how to rethink your cover crop program. Should you have a more competitive or less competitive cover crop? Should you remove more aggressively lateral growth? Should you drive a more aggressive or less aggressive irrigation program or fertilization program? All of that will affect and your wood production. And if it's in excess, you're going to drive them towards a reduction and vice versa. So which is what I meant here with this slide. Detecting wood production variations, not only a decline, but just variations, will help you adjusting your practices based on last year carryover effects. So if it's an excess of wood production, you will drive your management strategy towards mitigating that excess. If there is a deficit in wood production, before you observe a yield decline, you will be proactive by driving strategies maybe towards less irrigation, less fertilization, and less growing point at pruning.
And can you help me understand real quick, just like if you're using a cover crop or irrigation, how that helps in competition or helps you with reducing or managing wood?
Imagine you have 10 shoots left at pruning, and your block was already showing signs of decline. Well, those 10 shoots, if while they are growing, they are competing against a cover crop that's taking away from the vine nutrients, that's taking away from the vine water, each of those 10 shoots are going to be weaker, thinner. And that will mean less reserves, less ability to have a high photosynthetic activity later during the season, because the staggering of the leaves will be less optimum. You may also have a shorter shoot length, and all of that may threaten the shoot ability to provide enough sugars for the fruits to ripen. So this is essentially why cover crop may threaten a good development of the shoot to sustain the yield.
Great. Thank you. And so moving into our next part, this is an area that very interested, and I'll have a lot of questions. And for the audience as well, please, as we're going through this, type your questions out. We have people helping us field these questions, so the more questions, the better. We'll try to get to them all. So how are we going to align our pruning strategy with our yield and quality goals?
Yeah, so really the key thing to achieve here is balance. So what is balance? How do you define balance? Let me spend 2 slides on making sure we are on the same wavelength when talking about balance. So when I speak about balance, not only me, I mean, typically balance refers to the fact that we try to have a good ratio between the amount of vegetation and the amount of fruit. And why is that so critical? Because if this ratio is not in a good proportion, like let's imagine we have more leaf area given the number of fruit we are trying to ripen, a lot of the energy will go into the plant towards maintaining this vegetative expression. And for the fruit, it means that the ripening will be delayed. And it is typically what winemakers come back at after the end of the season saying, I had larger berries, my wine lacked concentration, and I had to pick in a rush because the sugar was never there or was too slow in being accumulated. And often, it's not the only reason, but often it comes from lack of balance between the amount of fruit being too small compared to the amount of leaves being produced. And the opposite is true, actually. If you go into a situation where you are overcropping your vineyards, you have in that case a lot of fruits which are acting as energy sinks. So essentially, each fruit essentially is demanding a lot of energy coming from either the reserves, the wood, or the leaf photosynthesis activity. But if you have too many of those sinks, it's going to be hard for the fruit to ripen. And this is typically what we observe in situations where the brix is stalling. And then we see that sugar concentration stops around 19, 20, and seems not to move along. And then dehydration occurs, so we see the brix going up, but not because the fruit is properly ripening. And again, at harvest, winemakers are complaining that the wine lacks concentration, that color concentration is poor, and eventually they complain about the quality not being there simply because the fruit underwent an incomplete maturity. And this is why balancing the vineyard is key to maintain a good quality. So this actually brings me to the next slide. When I realized that we needed a method to diagnose vineyard balance, I created the framework I'm going to share with you, with the goal in mind that we were going to find a way to assess trends, because let's be frank, there is no magic number for the balance. It's not there is no such a thing as you need to have exactly twice the weight in terms of pruning corresponding to your yield. Each situation is different. You might be in Washington where you have a lot of light for a shorter amount of time. That's going to compensate some situations you may see in Bordeaux where you have more cloud cover and therefore less light. So yeah, I think we should really be putting ourselves in a framework where we are not looking at a specific number, but rather looking at trends. And so the framework I'm going to share with you, because pruning is such a big pain point, and because we are lacking a method to diagnose what may cause a poor vineyard balance, is the following. But before I dive into that, I wanted to ask you, Ryan, if you had questions.
Yeah, I was curious, I know there's no specific numbers to what is balance and what is that, golden ratio, but when you're looking at trends, what are you looking for? Like what your vineyard has produced before? What kind of data are you looking at historically?
Yeah, so when I look at a trend, essentially I'm going to look at any potential memory effect from last year at affecting next year production. So this is why we absolutely need to get into our analytical framework the yield from last year. And if you go to the next slide, I have tried to really simplify what we are looking at. So eventually, what we are looking at on the left axis, the y-axis, is the amount of sinks we get by looking at the fruit. So we may look at the fruit by looking at how much color it accumulates, how much sugar it accumulates, or simply put, how much yield the vineyard is producing. And on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, we are going to try to quantify some things that says how much wood the plant is producing. And generally speaking, good fruit productions for wine quality are obtained when there is a balance, meaning when there is more fruit being produced, there is also more wood being produced. And when less fruit is being produced, there is also less wood being produced. So this is what I have in mind when analyzing the data. And what is a poor balanced vineyard is actually what I have tried to describe in the next slide. You see on the upper left, you have a situation in the upper left corner where you have too much yield and not enough wood. That means not enough reserve to sustain a high fruit production from one year to the next, which means you are in a situation where the risk is really high to observe a yield decline next year. You are also in a situation where the risk is high to have a poor maturity or unripe flavors. Now, if we go toward,
So
go ahead.
I was just going to say, so looking at this chart here, it really helps simplify it for me. So if I'm looking at last year's yield compared with the shoot diameters that I'm seeing if I've taken this measurement last year, and this is my second year that I'm taking it, if I'm looking at those high yield numbers and my shoot diameter has gone down, is that a way to see that I'm not quite in balance?
Exactly, but we will see that we can be much more accurate. You get the gist, but we can be much more accurate because actually we're going to look at the shoot number, the shoot diameter, and the combination of the two to refine our diagnosis. So right now, before I dive into how practically we apply that, I want you to make sure you understood. Get back to the same slide, please, because I also wanted to spend some time explaining the situation in the bottom right corner. In the bottom right corner, this is not a good situation to be in because here we have a typical situation. I see that often with Pinot Noir, for instance, where we have a lot of wood being produced and not enough yield, not enough sinks. And so typically that means that when you are in a bottom right corner, you have too much plant energy going into making more vegetative parts. You don't have enough fruit to divert some of this energy toward making fruit. And again, you are at risk of observing a degraded quality, which typically translate into winemaker comments such as vegetative aromas, delayed ripening leading to harsher tannins. So what I want you to really get is that you have bad balance symbolized by those red crosses, and you have good balance symbolized by those green circles that we've seen just before. And now we're going to use this framework to reassess what should be the best practices. But I felt I needed to spend some time sharing this conceptual basis. Otherwise, the justification of the diagnosis is really hard to get.
Great. Right. So which brings us to, there's not a magic number. How do we define that balance? So how are we able to move those X's into the O's, into the green area where we want it to be?
Yeah. So now that I have shared with you this framework, let's apply what I call a 3 steps method. The 3 steps method is always the same. First, you assess wood index. Second, you assess shoot diameter. And third, you assess the number of shoots. And once you have a diagnosis for each of those 3 indices, then you have revealed a key feature that affects your vineyard balance. So let's see how we can do that. The next slide is actually the data acquisition part. Here you see, so actually it's not a pre-pruning machine. Here we were just mapping the shoot number and shoot diameter and wood index. By dragging this machine, you see there is a U-shape structure that support devices that are sending a laser beam from one side of the vineyard row to the other side of the vineyard row. And as the ATV is moving along the vineyard row, we get a very precise counting on how many shoots per vine and what is each individual shoot diameter. And then you have a map. Okay, so by combining those 3 maps with Fruition Science's analytical support, essentially we are going to help you decipher and interpret those maps to support your management decision. And why is that important? What is actually the risk you are taking if you do not have this information to back up your decision? Well, the key here is that you just want to correct enough. You just want to have too much action or too little action, because otherwise you see that if you try to get yourself outside of a situation such as the one in the upper left corner, you have too much yield and not enough wood. You can either try to go right by boosting irrigation and boosting fertilization, reducing the stress. But if you overdo it, then you may not be pleased with the results. The other action or decision is to go down by reducing the number of shoots left at pruning. You hope to reduce the diameter and rebalancing your vineyard. So that would be the most natural decision to take to get yourself outside of a bad situation. But if you go, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to double check. So here, just to be clear, we're looking at how we can use those 3 indices to move our vineyard into balance, left or right. Correct. We're using the wood index, the shoot diameter, and we're going to look at how those will push it up or down.
I will tell you in a second with a case study.
For clarification. Okay, yeah, just to check with the audience if there's any clarification needed, or if y'all have got any questions where we're at in the process of showing you how to balance. So I'll let you go for it, Thibault.
I go back. Okay. The other situation is symbolized by the next slide, where you try to get yourself out of a situation on the next slide where you have too much wood being produced and not enough yield. So you either want to go left by inducing more stress, or you either want to go up by increasing the shoot number, hoping that you're going to have a reduction in shoot diameter. So I have summarized why those situations are risky in the next slide. In the next slide, the risk, if you overdo it by going towards your right, is that if you try eventually to boost fertilization or irrigation, you may end up with more shoots and each shoot displaying a larger diameter. And again, you are not fixing the problem because you have poorer fruit quality, you delay ripening, and the wine has even more vegetative character. And if you try to go down by reducing the yield, by reducing the number of shoots left after pruning, you may increase each individual shoot diameter, which again brings you to less yield and poorer fruit quality. So this is the risk we're going to be trying to mitigate. And if you go to the next slide, the risk if you overdo it by leaving more shoots on the node or on the vine by going up is to have more shoots, but each shoot with an even smaller diameter, which makes it hard to ripen, which typically brings you to have low wine concentration and harsher tannins. And the same is true if you overdo it with stress, trying to go towards the left, because it's typically difficult to tame down a vineyard that has had a history of high vegetative expression. So it's difficult to control stress induction in a vineyard with a historical high vegetation. So this is why I feel.
And
yeah.
I was going to ask you, so on this part, looking at the stress, where you use the crop that you had mentioned earlier, if you want to take it left to put more competition to the vine.
Sorry, I did not understand the question.
So moving this red X over to the left, we state here that we can use deficit irrigation, but could you also, earlier when I was asking you about cover crops and how that could help manage.
Exactly. You could use cover crop.
An example.
You could use a competitive cover crop for water and nitrogen, for instance, towards the goal of going to the left. Yes, definitely.
Okay. I'm just trying to make sure I understood the levers to go left and right and up and down in our scenario. Okay.
So now let's get practical and apply this 3 steps approach. Let's discuss what happens when we analyze wood index. I have taken an example where we're going to be actually looking at wood index, then shoot diameter, and then shoot number, because this is actually what you may be doing. So because there is no magic number, the idea is to always have a block that is a good performer and use it as a reference. And then you confront this reference with a block where you're not very happy with the results. So it's a real life situation case where we have here on your left a very good performer. It's a vineyard in California. The management is about 100 acres, and those 2 blocks are really tricky, because on the left you have a good block where the average wood index is 450 square millimeter of shoot section per ground area, and it's the favorite winemaker block. And next to it you have a block where you see that on average the wood index is lower, but it produces large cluster, and berry sizes are also very large, and the winemaker complains that the wine lacks concentration. So we are going to try, like a detective, to really understand what may cause this low wood index, which we suspect is one of the reasons why the winemaker is not happy with the quality. So what caused this unbalance? So when we look at that, we know that the bad block has a low wood index. But now the question is it because we have a low shoot number, or is it because we have a low shoot diameter? That's when we go to step analytic stage number 2. We look at the diameter map, and we see that on average in the good block we have shoot diameter around 10 millimeter, whereas the shoot diameter on average in the bad block is 12. So this might not look like it's a lot, but remember, the shoot section uses that number at the square, because a shoot section is basically multiplying the radius by at the square. So 1 millimeter of differences in the diameter is a lot in terms of shoot section. So here we have a very strong hint that one of the reasons why this block is out of balance is maybe because it makes too large shoots, too thick of shoots. So now the next question is, okay, so now we have maybe fairly large shoots, but are we sure that actually we also have low shoots, or is it actually a high shoot number that is attached to this vineyard? So at this point, we don't know. We can only go towards the next slide, which is the conclusion after our shoot diameter analysis, is that we have a low wood index, we have a high shoot diameter. Therefore, we think, well, increasing the number of shoots at pruning might be a good practice, providing shoot number is low. So the next question is, well, is my shoot number low or high? That's where we go on to step analysis number 3. And at this point, we have a confirmation. Yes, we observe that on average, the shoot number is around 16 in the good block when it's around 13 in the bad block. So now we've wrapped up our mindset on potential sources of explanation why this block is not a great performer. We know that that's what I have actually summarized in the next slide. We know that when comparing the good block with the bad block, step 1 tells us wood index is lower. Then step 2 tells us shoot diameter is higher. Step 3, that shoot number is lower. And we diagnose that the imbalance resulting in poor quality is associated to a low wood index, which is itself caused by a low shoot number. Do you understand?
Great. Yeah, that's what I was just trying to map it out here. So starting out looking at it, we had a high yield and a low wood index. So that put us in the top left of that box.
Yeah.
And then after analyzing the 3 steps, we realize we have the shoot count is where we need to focus.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. So now you have a very data-driven technique and method to support your decision, which is now the action that you can take based on those maps. The action is what I have summarized in the next slide. You have now the confidence to say that you can adjust your pruning criteria, and you can be, depending upon your management strategy, thinking on a block scale that more nodes are needed in the bad block. So at pruning, change your criteria and try to increase them so that on average next year we'll have 16 nodes instead of 13. Or if you're really managing that block at a very precise level, you can actually refine your pruning criterion by saying that an intra-block scale, you may target a specific zone where node number per vine should be higher. And this is what I have shown in my last slide. You see here, next to each other, the maps of shoot number per vine, and I have pointed on your left the area where shoot number is really small, less than 13. And you see on your right-hand side the area of your vineyard where shoot diameter is too high, over 12 millimeter. And this is really where most of the benefits will come if you try to achieve a more uniform block. So you can either think at a large scale, well, this is a block where I need to boost my number of nodes at pruning, or you can think at a much more precise scale, this is the area where locally I need to have more nodes per vine. And so the conclusion to that is that, of course, it's a webinar, so I have tried to really simplify. You can go to the next slide. I try to simplify how wood index and yield management could be achieved through pruning. But of course, I do not discount the fact that nitrogen, water, and canopy management are also part of the equation to achieve a better vineyard balance. But what we shared with you is a simplified explanation to focus on pruning. However, our 360 VT method will also address other management challenges in the same mindset later in the season.
Great. Well, this is super informative. For the audience, we're coming towards the end of our slides, so if y'all have got any questions, just to recap and help you understand, please just type in your message box, and we can start answering a few questions if you'd like.
At the end of the day, know 3 things about your vineyards in order to optimize your decision. Know the shoot diameter, know the shoot number per vine, and know the product of shoot number by shoot diameter. And now that you have that index, use the fact that you can map the spatial distribution of those indices to refine, either in terms of pruning criteria or in terms of overall management of the vineyard from a canopy standpoint or from a stress management standpoint, where you should go and how intense you should go. So just starting off the season by looking at the relationship between yield last year in one hand and shoot number and shoot diameter in the other hand, and looking at the combined effect of shoot diameter and shoot number using the wood index is a very simple way to refine objectively and justify why you take your decision.
Yeah. I think I've got a just to double check if but I had a question come through. Anybody have any questions, please feel free. If not, we're just going to let you know that you can contact me, Ryan@fruitionsciences.com. We are recording this webcast, so we'd love to send a copy out to each of the attendees. That way, if you've got any questions, you can come back to it. So yeah, just keep in mind, the importance of knowing your shoot numbers and shoot diameters to help you make those, understand your levers to move your blocks to the right or left and get you in the balance that you need, that you're looking for. Thibaut, any parting thoughts?
No.
Okay, well, great. Well, oh wait, hold on. Looks like Jim asked one question. So in California, how can we facilitate the measurement process and technology used while we're keyed in on nutrient irrigation cover crop? As discussed, the pruning strategies are the other factor we're working on. So how do we facilitate this measurement process?
So my suggestion is to be very methodological. You start by looking at the wood, and now you've identified areas that could be addressed with pruning. But that's not to say that pruning is the only tool you can use. Then the next stage, and that probably will be another webinar, is to assess how quickly nitrogen accumulates and when does nitrogen stops from accumulating, because we will see with our sampling method that there is a specific timing during which the vine is able to accumulate nitrogen and then it stops. So by looking at the flow of nitrogen inside the plant non-destructively and at 6, 7, or 8 different dates during the season, we can better assess nitrogen stress. And then we'll be doing the same with water stress by looking precisely at the flow with which water is going into the plant. And at the end, you close a little bit more the equations, because you have info on wood production, you have info on nitrogen uptake, you have info on water uptake, and then at the end, you have an information on yield. And this data together, once it's integrated in an analytical framework, helps you building a better decision framework. And very interestingly, it also helps you building a better ability to predict what's going to be your vineyard performance in the long run.
Great. And we've got one question. This is a great question. I didn't even think of it earlier, but when is the best time to go in with this Physiocap and take this measurement?
As soon as the leaves have fallen on the ground. So right now is a good time to start scheduling the Physiocap.
Yeah. And Brittany asked that question. That's a good one, because the method that the Physiocap is using with the lasers, if you still have dead leaves on the vine, then that's going to affect your measurement. So you've got to make sure that all the leaves are off. So is the laser measurement data collection process available for our use? And I think I can answer this, yes. The device is for purchase. So if you want to figure out how to use it, you can contact me on the information on the screen at ryan@fruitionsciences.com. I can help you out with that. Okay, well, some great data here. Thibaut, I appreciate it. I've learned a lot. I've been taking notes this entire time. It's always a pleasure to get to kind of spend this time learning what you've been doing and seeing in the vineyard for these past years. So thank you for your time today, Thibaut.
You're welcome.
Great. Well, like I said, anybody, if you've got questions, please just find us on LinkedIn as well. We're on all the social media channels. So LinkedIn, Facebook, and here's my email. So please reach out. We love, even if just to discuss these topics, it's what we're here for. So thanks again, Thibaut. And with that, I think we'll sign off for the day.
Bye-bye.
Take care.